Good night. It is 3 minutes past 9, and I'm going to continue with the saints, butlers, the lives of the saints. I'm just going to find the right page, and I've been praying all evening before I've been reading, so I'm not going to pray because I think there's quite a lot of reading to do, and I've been praying consistently for a long while. So I'm now going to begin immediately with the readings of Butlers, the saints, the lives of the saints. I usually would do this in the daytime, but I'll bring the microphone near and I can keep my head down a bit. So the main saint for today, actually it's written as the 12th of August, and yet they put it up yesterday as her saint day, St. Clare, Virgin, foundress of the poor CLARES or MINORESSES, AD 1253. So if I don't do all of them, I'm definitely going to read her life. The Lady Clare, shining in name, more shining in life, most shining in conversation, was a native of Assisi, of noble birth, and by grace nobler, a maiden most pure in heart, young in years, but hoary in determination, most steadfast in purpose, but withal wise and meek, and a marvellous lover of Christ. She was born about the year 1193. You know, my eyes are bad. I'm just going to stop for a moment and reach across and take my other glasses and see if the font is any better with these. There's a slight improvement. It's only slight, but even slight will help. Okay, sorry about that. It's just that I decided I would do this in the evening, but it is better in the daylight. It's okay, I'll continue. Young in years, but hoary in determination, most steadfast in purpose, but withal wise. I'm going to sit more comfortably. Wise and meek, and a marvellous lover of Christ. She was born about the year 1193. Her mother was Ortolana di Fiumi, and her father Favarone of Reducio, and she had a younger sister, Agnes, and another Beatrice. But her childhood, adolescence, and home life, there are no certain facts. When she was 18, St. Francis of Assisi, obviously, came to preach the Lenten sermons at the church of San Giorgio in Assisi. His words fired her. She sought him out secretly and asked him to help her, that she too might live after the manner of the Holy Gospel. Francis spoke to her of contempt for the world and love of God, and strengthened her nascent desire to leave all things for Christ. On Palm Sunday in the year 1212, Clare attended at the Cathedral of Assisi for the blessing of palms, when all the rest went up to the altar rails to receive their branch of olive. A sudden shyness kept her in her place. which the bishop seeing, he went from the altar down to her and gave her the branch. In the evening she ran away from home and went a mile out of the town to the Portiuncula, where St. Francis lived with his little community. He and his brethren met her at the door of the chapel of Our Lady of the Angels, with lighted tapers in their hands, and before the altar she put off her fine clothes, and St. Francis cut off her hair and gave her his penitential habit, which was a tunic of sackcloth tied about her with a cord. The Holy Father, not having yet any nunnery of his own, placed her for the present in the Benedictine convent of St. Paul, near Bastia, where she was affectionately received. It would seem that the relatives of St. Clare, her father was probably dead, had proposed a particular marriage that did not recommend itself to her, but she did not entirely renounce the idea of matrimony in general until the burning words of Francis persuaded her to commit her maidenhood finally to God. Then followed what G.K. Chesterton called this regular romantic elopement, in which the bridegroom was Christ and St. Francis, the knight-errant, who gave it a happy ending. No sooner was her action made public, but her friends and relations came in a body to draw her out of her retreat. It is said that Clare resisted and held to the altar so fast as to pull its cloths half off when they endeavoured to drag her away, and uncovering her head to show her hair cut, she said that Christ had called her to his service, and that she would have no other husband, and that the more they should continue to persecute her, the more God would strengthen her to resist and overcome them. And God triumphed in her. St. Francis soon after removed her to another nunnery, that of Sant Angelo di Panzo. There her sister Agnes joined her, which drew on them both a fresh persecution. Agnes's constancy proved at last victorious, and St. Francis gave her also the habit, though she was only 15 years of age. It may be noted that in the bull of canonization, Pope Alexander IV makes no mention of any violence being used in the attempt to dissuade Clare and her sister from their new life. Eventually, St. Francis placed them in a poorhouse contiguous to the house of St. San Damiano on the outskirts of Assisi, and appointed Clare the superior. She was later joined by her mother and others, among whom 3 were of the illustrious family of the Ubaldini in Florence, who held for truer greatness, the sackcloth and poverty of St. Clare, than the estates and riches which they possessed. Seeing they left them all to become humble disciples of so admirable a mistress, St. Clare saw founded within a few years monasteries of her nuns at several places, in Italy, France, and Germany. Blessed Agnes, daughter to the King of Bohemia, founded a nunnery of the order in Prague, in which she took the habit and was called by Clare, my half-self. Saint Clare and her community practised austerities which till then had scarcely been known among women. They wore neither stockings, shoes, sandals, or any other covering on their feet. They slept on the ground, observed perpetual abstinence from meat, and never spoke. But when they were obliged by necessity and charity, the foundress recommended this holy silence as the means to avoid innumerable sins of the tongue, and to preserve the mind always recollected in God, and free from the dissipation of the world, which, without this guard, penetrates even the walls of cloisters. Not content with fasts and other mortifications of the rule, she always wore, next to her skin, a rough shirt of hair. She fasted on vigils, and all Lent on bread and water, and on some days she ate nothing at all. All Clare's austerities were on the same scale, and after a time it became necessary for Francis and the Bishop of Assisi to oblige her to lie upon a mattress and never pass one day without taking at least some bread for nourishment. Discretion came with experience, and years later she wrote to Blessed Agnes of Bohemia, "Since our bodies are not of brass, and our strength is not the strength of stone, but rather are we weak and subject to corporal infirmities, I implore you vehemently in the Lord to refrain from exceeding rigour of abstinence, which I know you practice, so that living and hoping in the Lord, you may offer him a reasonable service and a sacrifice seasoned with a salt of prudence." Saint Francis wished that his order should never possess any rents or other property, even in common, subsisting on daily contributions, and Saint Clare possessed this spirit in perfection. Pope Gregory IX desired to mitigate this part of her rule, and offered to settle a yearly revenue on the poor ladies of San Damiano, but she did, in the most pressing manner, persuaded him by many reasons, in which her love of evangelical poverty made her eloquent, to leave her order in its first rigorous establishment. When the Pope offered to dispense from the vow of strict poverty, Saint Clare replied, "I need to be absolved from my sins, but I do not wish to be absolved from the obligation of following Jesus Christ." Gregory accordingly granted, in 1228, the privilegium paupertatis, that they might not be constrained by anyone to accept possessions. He who feeds the birds of the air and gives raiment and nourishment to the lilies of the field will not leave you in want of clothing or food until he comes himself to minister to you for eternity. The convents of Perugia and Florence also received this privilege, but others thought it more prudent to accept a mitigation. Thus began the two observances which have ever been perpetuated among the poor Clares. The mitigated houses are called urbanist from the modification of the rule given to them in 1263 by Pope Urban VI. After the death of Gregory IX, who as Cardinal Ugolino had drawn up the first written rule for the poor ladies of San Damiano, Innocent IV, in 1247, published another recension of the rule, which in some respects brought it nearer to Franciscan than to Benedictine observance, but which permitted the holding of property in common. He wrote that he did not wish to force this rule on any community unwilling to accept it. St. Clare was unwilling, and she, as the living depository of the spirit and tradition of St. Francis himself, set to work to draw up a rule which should truly express them, and which unequivocally provides that the sisters shall possess no property, either as individuals or as a community. It was not until 2 days before she died that this rule was approved for the convent by San Damiano by Pope Innocent IV. From the time when she was appointed abbess, much against her will, by St. Francis in 1215, St. Clare governed the convent for 40 years, but it was her wish always to be the servant of servants, beneath all, washing and kissing the feet of the lay sisters when they returned from begging, serving at table, attending the sick. She had, as it were, wings to fly wherever St. Francis directed her, and was all ready to do anything or to put her shoulders under any burden that was enjoined. Dispose of me as you please. I am yours, by having given my will to God. It is no longer my own. Whilst her sisters took their rest, she watched long in prayer, and tucked the nuns up when their bedclothes had come loose. She was the first that rose, rang the bell in the choir, and lighted the candles. She came from prayer with a face so shining, like that of Moses coming down from conversing with God, that it dazzled the eyes of those that beheld her, and she spoke with such a spirit of fervour as to enkindle those who did but hear her voice. She had a wonderful devotion towards the Blessed Sacrament, and even when sick in bed, she ailed grievously for the last 27 years of her life. She made fine linen corporals and cloths for the service of the altar, which she distributed among the churches of Assisi. The powerful force and efficacy of St. Clare's prayer is well illustrated by a story told by Thomas of Celano, which may well be true. In 1244, the Emperor Frederick II ravaged the valley of Spoleto because it was the patrimony of the Holy See. He had in his army many Saracens, and these infidels came once in a body to plunder Assisi, and as San Damiano stood without the walls, they first assaulted it. St. Clare, though very sick, caused herself to be carried to the wall and the Blessed Sacrament to be placed there in a pikes in the sight of the Picts, in the sight of the enemies. Prostrating herself before it, she prayed, saying, "Does it please thee, O God, to deliver into the hands of these beasts the defenceless children whom I have nourished with thy love? I beseech thee, good Lord, protect these whom I am now not able to protect." And she heard a voice, like the voice of a little child, saying, "I will have them always in my care." Then Clare prayed for the city of Assisi, and again the voice came, reassuring her, and she turned to the trembling nuns and said, "Have no fear, little daughters, trust in Jesus." Terror at the same time seized the assailants, and they fled with such precipitation that several were hurt without being wounded by an enemy. Shortly after, a general of the same emperor laid siege to Assisi for many days. St. Clare said to her nuns that they who received corporal necessaries from that city owed it all the assistance in their power in its necessity. She therefore bid them cover their heads with ashes, and in this suppliant fashion to beg of Christ the deliverance of the town. They continued this with many tears a whole day and night, till God in his mercy so made issue with temptation that the besiegers melted away, and their proud captain with them, for all he had sworn an oath to take the city. Another popular story, namely of St. Clare and one of her nuns, leaving the cloister of San Damiano and going to the Porticula to sup with St. Francis, and the marvellous light which radiated from the room, is less deserving of credence. The event in itself, exceedingly unlikely, is mentioned by no contemporary or by any writer for at least 150 years. And Thomas of Celano, who often heard St. Francis warning his followers to avoid any injudicious association with the poor ladies, states categorically that St. Clare never left the walls of San Damiano. Unhappily, even during her life, and for long after her death at intervals, there was disagreement between the poor Clares and the Friars Minor as to the relations of the two orders, the observant Clare maintaining that the friars were under obligation to serve them in things both spiritual and temporal. I must take a drink. Excuse me a moment. you. I'm just trying to find my place. In this connection, Thomas of Celano has a story which, if it be the source of much trouble to historians, at least is illuminating on the subject of the stalwart and inflexible character of Clare. When Pope Gregory IX in 1230 forbade the friars to visit the convents of nuns without his special license, she feared that this would mean a loss of spiritual help to be obtained from the friars and a severing of the ties St. Francis had wished should subsist between them. She thereupon dismissed every one of them attached to the convent, saying, "Now that he has deprived us of our spiritual almoners, let him also take them that serve our material needs. If she could not have one, she would not have the other." St. Clare bore years of sickness with sublime patience, and at last, in 1253, the long-drawn-out agony began. Twice during its course, she was visited by Pope Innocent IV, who gave her absolution, saying, "Would to God I had so little need of it." For the last 17 days, she was able to eat nothing, and during that weary time of labour, my nose is tickling me. Sorry. So irritating. Okay, I'm just getting back to where she's so ill. For the last 17 days, she was able to eat nothing, and during that weary time of labour, the faith and devotion of the people increased more and more. Every day, prelates and cardinals came to call on her, for all men were firmly convinced that this dying woman was truly a saint. Her sister, St. Agnes, was there, and 3 of the companions of St. Francis, Leo, Angelo, and Juniper, who read aloud to her the Passion of the Lord according to St. John, as they had done at his deathbed 27 years before. And when Brother Reginald exhorted her to patience, she replied, "Dear brother, ever since, by means of his servant Francis, I have known the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. I have never in my whole life found any pain or sickness that could afflict me." Seeing her spiritual children weep, she comforted them and tenderly exhorted them to be constant lovers and faithful observers of holy poverty, and gave them her blessing, calling herself the little plant of her Holy Father Francis. And to herself she was heard to say, "Go forth in peace, for you have followed the good road. Go forth without fear, for he that created you has sanctified you, has always protected you, and loves you as a mother. Blessed be thou, O God, for having created me." Thus was the passing of Blessed Clare. It was on the morrow of Blessed Lawrence that she received her laurel crown, For on that day the temple of her body was dissolved, her most holy soul went forth, and exulting in its freedom soared on the wings of gladness to the place which God had prepared for it. It was the 42nd year after her religious profession, and at the 60th of her age. She was buried on the day following, on which the church keeps her festival. Pope Alexander IV canonized her at Anagni in 1255. I would like to read the small font, very small it is, but I can't. It's at the bottom, and I'm sure it's very, very interesting, but my eyes can't cope with that size. I've barely read this. So I'm continuing with the saints for the same day, the 12th of August. This is a very strange name, EUPLUS, EUPLUS Martyr, Saint EUPLUS Martyr, AD 304. Oh, that's my son James's birthday, but not that year. It says on April 29th, 304. Well, his was 1976. On April the 29th, 304, during the persecution of Diocletian at Catania in Sicily, a man called EUPLUS or EUPLIUS, they've spelt it two ways, was heard shouting outside the governor's court, "I am a Christian and I'm willing to die for it." The governor, Calvisian, heard him and ordered that he who had made that noise should be brought in. EUPLUS appeared accordingly, carrying a book of the Gospels, whereat a bystander remarked, "You have got wicked writings, contrary to the emperor's orders. Where do they come from?" asked Calvisian. "From your house?" EUPLUS, "I haven't got a house, as the Lord knows." Calvisian, "Do these writings belong to you?" EUPLUS, "As you see." Calvisian, "I see that you're carrying them. What are they? Read me something." EUPLUS, "I know them well. They are the Holy Gospels according to the Holy Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John." Calvisian, "What is that all about?" EUPLUS, "It is the law of God, my God, that I have received from him." Calvisian, "Somebody's taught you all this." EUPLUS, "I have just said that I learned it from our Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Calvisian, "That's enough. Take him to prison." 3 months and more later, on August the 12th, EUPLUS was again brought before the governor, and Calvisian asked him, "What do you say now?" EUPLUS, "What I have said before, I say again today." Calvisian, "Do you still keep those forbidden writings?" EUPLUS, "I do." Calvisian, "Where are they?" EUPLUS, "Within me." Calvisian, "If you've still got them, bring them here." EUPLUS repeated, "They are within me," and showed by a gesture that he knew them by heart. Well done. Whereupon Calvisian ordered him to be tortured till he should consent to sacrifice to the gods. He was tormented in vain, and the governor again exhorted him, "The enemies of our great deities, those who defy our emperors and persist in their criminality, must die in their sufferings." EUPLUS has said insane things before this court, and I adjure the sacrilegious man to turn over, withdraw them if he does not want to die. But he appealed in vain, and EUPLUS was sentenced to be beheaded, which sentence was carried out. And there's quite a bit of writing underneath that, but I'm unable to read it, so I can't share it with you. It's some extra notes. So I'll continue with the next saint. There's only 2 or 3 paragraphs left, and I'll read it. I can't read it without getting close. Saint MURTAGH, or MUREDACH, bishop, 6th century ? He was one of the royal family of King Leodghaire and is reputed to have been the first bishop in Killala by the appointment of St. Patrick. It seems probable, however, that he lived at a later date. For the life of St. Cormac, it is stated that the harbour of Killala was blessed in turn by Patrick, Brigid, Colmcille, Kenny and Muredach, which, as Canon of O'Hanlon says, does not sound as if Patrick and Muredach were contemporaries. Moreover, he is stated to have met St. Colmcille at Ballysodare, near Sligo, after Colmcille's conference with the Irish king at Drumkeith in 575. St. Muredach's feast is kept throughout Ireland. On the same day he was venerated another St. Muredach, who was a monk at the monastery of Inniskeen in Lough Erne in the 7th century. There seems to be no life of this saint either in Latin or Irish, but there is a curiously obscure reference to him on the day of Philia of Onigus. So the final saint for the lives of the saint for the 12th of August of martyrs, St. Porcarius and his companions, martyrs, AD 732. At the beginning of the 5th century, the great abbey of Lerins was founded on an island off the coast of Provence, now known after the founder as Saint Honorat, opposite Cannes. By the 8th century, the community numbered over 500 monks, novices, alumni, and familiars, and about the year 732, the head of this great body, Abbot Porcarius, was warned by an angel that they were threatened by a descent of infidel barbarians from the sea. The medieval account calls these marauders Saracens. That is probably Moors from Spain or North Africa. Porcarius at once sent off to a place of safety all for whom there was no room on shipboard, namely the alumni or boys being educated in the monastery, and 36 of the young religious, and gathered together the remainder of his community, and prepared them for death, exhorting them to suffer bravely for the faith of Christ. The pirates landed, broke into the abbey, and slaughtered every one of its inmates, with the exception of 4, whom they carried off as slaves. Saint Porcarius and his monks are mentioned in the Roman Martyrology, and their feast is kept in the diocese of Frejus, but the story is not wanting in difficulties. Excuse me, sorry. Oh, this cold will not leave me. Thank you so much for listening. May God bless you and heal you. I'm sending you his peace in abundance, and may you always be happy and joyful in the Lord. And I'll tell you who's going to be read tomorrow if I get round to doing this. Saint Hippolytus, martyr, AD 235. Saint Cassian of Imola, martyr, date unknown. And this name is a bishop of Milan, AD 400. Saint Simplician and Saint Radegund matron, AD 587, and Saint Maximus the Confessor abbot, 662, and Saint Wigbert abbot, AD 738. This is an odd name. Saint Nerses, Nerses, Claes Etsi, Catholicus of the Armenians, AD 1173. Blessed Novellona, AD 1280. And Blessed Gertrude of Altenburg, Virgin, 1297. And then, goodness me, Blessed John of Alvernia, AD 1322. Blessed William Freeman, martyr, AD 1595. Saint Benildus, AD 1862. Gosh, that's long. He must have been special. And that's it. So that's for tomorrow. Thank you once again. God bless you all. Have a wonderful weekend and the rest of your evening, night, or even morning. And we'll be back soon. God bless.